Okay, so I have the honor of introducing our next speaker. So Ms. Shannon Angielski is a principal of governmental issues at VanNess Feldman in Washington, D.C. And the last time Shannon and I were here in Wyoming, I was not yet a resident. We were at a CCUS conference near Jackson, and we went on a hike. And I, at the time, had just had my shoulder reconstructed, so I was wearing a sling. And we had discussed whether or not we should have bear spray, and like didn't take it quite seriously enough so that we didn't have it. And we went on a 2.5, 3 mile hike, nothing epic, and got back. And right after we got back, they closed the trail because there was a grizzly on it right by where we were. And I knew at that moment that, you know, like the old adage, like I was going to be the one that wasn't the faster runner in that situation because of my injury, and also because Shannon would be faster than me. So, but we survived and we made it here today. So really grateful to introduce my friend Shannon Angielski, who practices in DC with VanNess Feldman, focused on developing and advocating for clean energy and carbon management. Her practice is principally focused on decarbonizing hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. And in my time, in my career has changed, moving from a purely technical researcher to having a broader view and getting more involved with government relations and communications, and now in academia. One thing I've learned is how important it is to have coalitions built that can be trusted on the Hill to weigh in on important legislation as it's being formed. And so Shannon and her team are really strong and have a long history of building strong coalitions. And so they're trusted resources on the Hill, and they're able through that to work with the senators and congressmen that are able to move legislation forward important to deploying clean energy technologies. And they do that by forming bridges, education, and advocacy. And examples are the Carbon Utilization Research Council, otherwise known as CURC, and the Clean Hydrogen Future Coalition, which does not have a pronounceable acronym. So other things you should know about Shannon: she's a great connoisseur of wine, a great friend, and if I have to be eaten by a bear watching someone else run away, it would definitely be Shannon. So thank you all so much, and thank you, Shannon, for being here.
Thank you, Holly. I have to just say, for, you know, you all are possibly residents of Wyoming, but on that very same trip with Holly, I have to say, typically when you walk into like a hotel, what is it, that there's like a welcome book and it tells you about all these exotic spa-like dining experiences. And we were at the National Park Service lodging at Jackson Hole, the Grand Tetons, and the book was What to Do If Attacked by a Grizzly Bear. That's what it was. And I thought, oh, welcome to Jackson Hole. It was very enlightening. So I was prepared to outrun Holly on that day. So let me just say that. I want to just thank Holly and the School of Energy Resources, the School of Law, the Dean, Sam, my friend and former colleague at VanNess Feldman, the State Bar, for the invitation and the privilege to be with you here today. I've heard a lot about this event in the past, and I'm just glad that I could be here to talk about hydrogen today, which is probably the new ice cream flavor of the month in Washington, D.C. So let me just start. Holly, gave my background, but for those of you that are not familiar with VanNess Feldman, we're an energy, environment, and natural resource firm. We were founded by Bill VanNess, who and Howard Feldman, who both worked as legal counsel on Senate Energy, what was then Insular Affairs committees. And I should probably be careful in saying this, but Bill VanNess was the principal drafter of the National Environmental Policy Act. So all good intentions, as the governor mentioned, but almost 50 years old now. So the point being is the firm sort of is found on that intersection of policy and law, and how to interpret policy and implement it in a way that is going to benefit both what we're trying to do from a sustainability standpoint, but then also to make sure that it is flexible enough for industry to operate within those frameworks. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the more recent federal policies that have been enacted with respect to what I'm going to call clean hydrogen. We are avoiding, we're going to be colorblind, and that's why we call it clean. We're thrilled that this administration has adopted the term clean, which has now worked itself through the international community, and everybody in the international community is now calling it clean. So we can, in small rooms, call it green, blue, purple, pink, whatever color you want, gray, but we are going to be colorblind. So let's just start with that. And then I will talk about some of just the, what are some of the, I guess, legal issues that are popping up right now, even aside from implementation of these new policies that will for sure keep many of you in this room busy for the next 12 or more years. I'm certain of that. So, but just wanted to start with just the hydrogen ecosystem. And I think many of you, Wyoming is so uniquely poised for this entire ecosystem, right? You have the all of the above with renewables, you have the all of the above with potentially nuclear coming in, and then clearly fossil with CCS. We can decarbonize your mineral resources in this state very well, and you have a grand opportunity to be a leader in the country, to be a producer. That H2 in the center is really just designed to show you what that midstream looks like. So a lot of the natural gas pipeline companies are leaning in very hard, including many that are here in the state, in terms of looking at what opportunity does hydrogen present from them from a long-term business standpoint. And then also, how can we blend hydrogen in pipelines? But that movement of hydrogen from the point of production to the point of end use is not potentially only going to be pipelines, although predominantly it will be. But you can move it in many different ways: trucks, rail, and you can even move it depending on, you know, the density of it, and if it's ammonia or otherwise, by ship and other modes of air transportation as well, right? And then lastly, we have a whole set of end use sectors. So we heard from the governor and the deputy secretary about how hard to decarbonize sectors. And this is where decarbonized hydrogen really comes into play, where CCS, for example, in some hard to decarbonize sectors like cement or steel, you just have so many multiple emission stacks in those facilities, for example, that may not all be amenable to capturing the CO2. And so you can use it as a source of heat to produce steam and other things that replaces the fuel sources that are otherwise, you know, fueled by fossil fuels predominantly today. So not in the electrification side, but on that side. So there really is a huge opportunity. So in looking at federal policy, the first policy that really was enacted for hydrogen were these clean hydrogen hubs. $8 billion for clean hydrogen, another $1 billion for electrolysis, research, development, and demonstration, and some other recycling and manufacturing types of programs for equipment for the hydrogen industry. I know that you all are familiar with the hubs. Wyoming is participating in a hub. The School of Energy Resources is going to be helping to lead in that regard with industry. So what I also wanted to just do is, I'm not going to go through this, but this is the recent hydrogen hub funding opportunity is what FOA stands for. And the recent funding opportunity is asking these hubs to submit at least initially a concept paper, which is really ahead of that left dark green bar that you see there. And those are due later this fall in early November. And the department will review those and then go back to the hub organizers, or what they call the prime applicants, and say, we encourage you to submit a full application, or they discourage you, and hopefully we'll tell you why. But what I wanted to point out here is that it's roughly $7 billion that they're looking at committing, at least initially, to reserve another $1 billion or so for future hub solicitations. But we're looking at roughly a 8 to 13 year program, with that funding being provided over time in these different milestone periods that you can see there. So you'll have the application, you'll have phase 1, really bringing your hubs together to do a lot of feasibility work. Let me just say that the whole purpose of doing these hubs, and as Holly mentioned, I represent a coalition that represent that full ecosystem of the hydrogen supply chain. And we worked very closely with Senators Manchin and Senators Barrasso in the development of the hubs. This came out of their committee. This industry, if you go back to this graphic here, this industry is not used to working together in very similar way that we are now working together in the CCS ecosystem. The oil and gas industry didn't really work with the utility, the electric generating industry or the industrial industry, right? So this is trying to figure out, how do we come together? How do we have transactions? How do we contract? How do we figure out each other's business model and figure out how to work together? Because that's as much of as the challenge to deployment and figuring out how to do this as it is to getting it right. And so that's what the hubs were designed to accomplish. Let's figure out how to get the producers, all different types, the entities that are going to be what they call the connective infrastructure, that H2 in the center there, and a number of these end users. It doesn't have to be all of them, but in these regional hubs, and figure out how to make the economies of scale there work, and then figure out how to either build out from there or connect the hubs. And that was the real thinking behind that and enacting that piece of legislation. And so the learn from doing will hopefully come from these hubs. So I expect that we'll see this next year, applications will be submitted in the early part of next year, and by the next fall, hopefully, we'll be here talking about an award that this Wyoming and the states that you all are working with, what you're going to be doing in your hub and with the department. So that's the first step. We look at that as sort of a down payment. The second is in the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a hydrogen production tax credit that was enacted. And what the PTC would do is it's really designed to bring down the cost of hydrogen production to what the average market cost of hydrogen is in the US today, which is roughly $1 or slightly more. Hydrogen is predominantly used for oil refining today. So if we're looking at that dollar per kilogram value on an energy content basis, for example, to replace another fuel source, the example that I use is that's roughly $8 in MMBTU of natural gas. And so if we're looking to replace natural gas, $1 a kilogram is not going to do that, right? So this is, again, just another starting point. It's the same in the transportation industry. It has to be roughly the equivalent of like 37 cents for diesel. It's going to take more than this, but again, another starting point. In the same way that 45Q was enacted in 2018, and then in the Inflation Reduction Act, we actually said we need that dollar value to go up to 85 or even more. We started here, and this is where we got. So one thing that I will say with the democratically controlled process is that there was a real attempt to disincentivize, or maybe it would be better to say to not over incentivize, in this room, I'm going to call it blue hydrogen production. And, from our coalition perspective, we have renewables, nukies, and major oils and gas companies. And we could not make headway to have them incentivize this further. If you look at the tax credit structure in that table there, it's a tiered structure based on the carbon intensity. And so the lowest carbon intensity clearly gets the highest tax credit. And that top tier will definitely incentivize wind. Depending on how far upstream a life cycle analysis looks at indirect material energy inputs, solar could hit that. It could actually fall into that second tier, mainly because of solar panels being manufactured in China, if they go that far upstream. So we had a number of concerns, especially that drop going from $3 down to $2. It's such a cliff that even from a financial certainty standpoint, we were concerned about some production pathways that might be right on the cusp, and what does that mean for attracting investment? So we had some challenges with the Democratic leadership, which are very conservative, liberal, I should say, on this issue in particular. Our proposed approach was a linear approach, which is for every percentage point of a carbon reduction you achieved, you get some value of a tax credit. So it's much more certain and much more of an incentive, but we'll keep trying on that front. It's a 10-year tax credit for a commenced construction. So that's good. The best news about this is that hydrogen and the carbon capture credits are eligible for what is called direct pay. That means if you don't have tax liability, or if you're a public entity or rural electric and you don't pay taxes, you essentially submit the form to IRS or Treasury at the end of the year, and they treat that in terms of how much hydrogen you've produced and what that value would be on a dollar per kilogram basis. And IRS will look at that as almost like an overpayment of your taxes. So you'll get a refund check, and it goes directly to the developer. That's the best part. We're avoiding the tax equity markets with these with a direct pay mechanism, which has really left a lot of industries on the sidelines in the clean energy innovation space and the deployment space. And that was something that we worked extremely hard on. And so we were pleased to see that at least hydrogen and CCS were able to get the benefit of at least a 5-year direct pay. You have the alternative to elect for transferability, which just means that you can sell your tax credits to somebody else and still avoid a very limited tax equity set of institutions, I should say banking institutions that have very limited funds for doing tax equity deals. So that was another important step there. Life cycle analysis, I'll just touch on that. That's going to be a huge issue for the industry going forward. And it's not going to be just for hydrogen. The Inflation Reduction Act also includes a technology neutral production tax credit for electricity generation that will begin in the January 1, 2025. But all of those sources of electricity will have to undergo life cycle analysis. So even carbon capture on coal or gas or any other form of carbon capture will have a life cycle analysis. And so this is just going to be the beginning of LCA discussions in Washington and with industries like yours that we're going to have to look at this. One of the things that we are proponents of is consistent boundaries upstream as well as downstream. The administration's already showing its cards, wanting to give renewables a net zero rating or standard, even though they have significant material inputs for energy and the production of those, the equipment and otherwise. So notwithstanding that, I encourage you to pay attention to that because it will be very important for the future of the industry being eligible for these types of programs. So I think many of you heard that one of the conditions of doing the Inflation Reduction Act for Senator Manchin was this permitting reform bill. And I suspect that many of you have seen some of the items that are on his list and the draft text that came out. With respect to hydrogen, one of the items that he included was for hydrogen pipelines. It was clear we have a very active pipeline regulatory practice, and we've been advising some clients, and one of my partners had been advising our coalition on how to think about blends and pure hydrogen interstate pipelines. And what is very clear is that there's no clear authority that lends itself to interstate transport of hydrogen pipelines. There's some that argue the Surface Transportation Board should regulate it because they regulate ammonia, but that's a commodity. Energy and energy commodities or the like are typically under FERC jurisdiction. STB is a very unknown regulator and a very absent and slow regulator. And so the pipeline companies, at least within our coalition, are all in agreement that they would prefer FERC. You know, as they say, it's the devil we know, and we know how to work with FERC. So we have, Chairman Glick has issued a letter in response to a request with a set of questions from Senator Heinrich that FERC, yes, FERC does have authority to regulate blends of hydrogen in natural gas pipelines under the Natural Gas Act. But pure hydrogen pipelines, that's still an open question. And so Senator Manchin wants to give regulatory certainty to the industry. And so what he's proposing is to open up the definition of natural gas under the Natural Gas Act. And that's what that bottom left-hand corner indicates in that highlighted yellow is you would include hydrogen, either pure or hydrogen blends under the Natural Gas Act. So that affords a number of pros and cons to this that the industry is evaluating. One clearly is eminent domain, right? That's and eminent domain, if we could be politically challenging to try to introduce an entirely new bill in Congress for hydrogen pipelines that would include that and maybe other attributes of regulation that we might prefer to see than under the Natural Gas Act, that could be challenging to get enacted. So this was an attempt to just try to get it done with the Democrats in control, to just open it up with very limited scope to do other things to the Natural Gas Act, which is also something that industry worries about with some of the Democrats in control. But as you can see, there's pros and cons. I will say that the cons in terms of rate regulations, the certificate process, and then, even though FERC can help to fast track permitting, it can also delay it. So, it's tipping the scales or weighing that. So this is something that industry is still trying to figure out where they want to come out on this, but we have bought ourselves some time that the permitting reform bill didn't get included in the 2023 continuing resolution. So we have more time to consider that. Other aspects of this that we've been exploring, and I'm not going to go into too much depth on this, but there's a lot of nuances if you're looking at hydrogen and the electricity sector and FERC regulation or state regulation, whether in wholesale or retail markets and the treatment of hydrogen. So if you're looking at, for example, using grid electricity to power an electrolyzer to produce hydrogen, in some respects, the state of New Mexico, for example, is allowing that to happen at wholesale rates. But from a FERC perspective, you typically have to use that hydrogen and in some way benefit by putting something back onto the grid. So if you're going to produce the hydrogen but not use it as some type of grid generating source of energy, you may not be able to get wholesale rates. And many industries right now that are looking to produce hydrogen are looking at transportation really as the early market that they're looking to produce hydrogen for. But alternatively, you might want to use that hydrogen as a backup to firm up your renewables, and you can put it in a gas turbine and you can run it, and it serves that long duration storage problem that we have that the batteries currently don't solve today. And so if your backup storage, well, they have such strict rules on what is deemed to be storage. It's almost essentially you must be a battery. And so it's looking at their rules of what, energy storage is and figuring out how best hydrogen can either fit within those rules or do we need to modify those? And so those are, again, some of the things that we're looking at under existing authorities and FERC regulations. But these are just some of the initial things that are coming up. There's a lot of entities that are looking at generating electricity, using the grid electricity to produce hydrogen from electrolyzers, and then others that are looking to back it up that there's no clear pathway at this moment. So I suspect that either the states are going to try to take this on and figure out what to do if they want to look at this positively. Another aspect of this is that FERC could look at this and try to give some signals to the states in terms of how they should be thinking about this from a policy standpoint. So those are some of the issues that we're also looking at and addressing. So that was really what I wanted to cover today. I'm going to have these slides available for you. I'm happy to take any questions. My contact information, I'm also here during the break. I just thought I would throw up the coalition members and just say University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources is a member, a very strong member. This state is really pioneering in all things, not just hydrogen, but CCS and carbon management. That it's a like I said, it's a real privilege to be able to work with you all. be able to benefit from what you are doing and help translate that into federal policy and make sure that it intersects with what you're doing here in the state and on the ground. So I really appreciate all the work that you're doing and the partnership that we have. So I'll stop there and take questions.
Glad to run the mic to anybody who has a question. And we have Emily as well. I'll handle this half of the room. Okay.
I was just curious about the use of hydrogen for transportation. Is that more in the commercial area or private cars?
So California has a pretty robust, it probably has one of the most robust light duty vehicle hydrogen markets in the country, probably the only one. I think where the transportation sector is looking at hydrogen is really in heavy duty vehicles because of the charge times that it takes from a battery standpoint and the distance that the relatively short distances that batteries enable. You can, from a fuel cell standpoint, you can go very long distances, almost cross country, with enough hydrogen on board to get your heavy duty goods transported across the country. So that's the at least in addition to the California market, that's the early sector that they're looking to convert over to hydrogen. There is some in the rail industry that are looking at that as well. You can move hydrogen as cargo, and then you can also use fuel cells and do the same, running your locomotives as well. That's a little bit further out, I think, but that's another aspect of this that we're looking at. And then the other is actually decarbonizing ports. So there's a lot of maritime vessels that are, especially because we have the Europeans that are really trying to decarbonize. And so they have ships that they want to run on ammonia, which is a much more dense form of hydrogen, and that you can carry on board. And so ports are looking to actually set up the fueling infrastructure because they don't have the ability to electrify that with these enormous ships, right? Between that and then also with these ports having such huge electricity demand, not just for the port itself, but for the cities around it. One ship can take up almost the entire load of a port and what the port's needs are. So they're looking to put that infrastructure in there from a fueling standpoint, but then also, you know, all of the cargo, the equipment that moves the cargo, they're looking to reduce the emissions from that equipment in the ports as well. And so that's an early incubator, I'll say, for looking at some of these transportation applications as well.
A quick question. So for blue hydrogen producers, I assume they can receive the tax credit from both 45V and 45Q, is that right?
No, so that's the challenge we have. Again, this goes to the point of, let me just say Senator Carper and Senator Wyden not wanting to incentivize blue hydrogen. So what you can do with 45V, if you're a taxpayer and you are going to produce hydrogen from renewable electricity, right? And you're a solar developer and you want to claim the ITC and you want to use half of your solar generation to go to the grid and the other half to power an electrolyzer and produce hydrogen, you can get that full solar array ITC, and for your hydrogen, you can get the 45V. Same with wind. You can do the same with nuclear. You cannot do that with 45Q and 45V. Now, the excuse that they used is that they see a CCS facility that's, a steam methane reformer that puts carbon capture on both the process and combustion emissions. They look at that as the same facility, whereas they look at the solar array and the electrolysis production facility as two separate facilities. That was the excuse they used, that it's the same taxpayer for purposes of a tax credit, so you can only claim one. We made every argument. You still have to compress, transport, and store the CO2, which is an entirely separate facility. You could have a taxpayer, the SMR could be one taxpayer, but you could have the CO2 capture system, a separate taxpayer, and, you know, the hydrogen production going to the SMR taxpayer and the CCS credits going. It didn't make a difference. So I think it was more politically charged than anything else. But unfortunately, the answer is no. Well, thank you again very much. I appreciate being here, and thank you again for the invitation.
Yeah, I think you should. Great.
Thank you. Yeah.